The rain-soaked streets of Maple Crest were eerily silent, save for the patter of raindrops and the low rumble of a lone car. In the shadows, a figure moved cautiously, clutching a small box close to their chest. This was no ordinary night. It was the eve of a war, a clash of wills between a defiant homeowner and the oppressive homeowners association that ruled this community with an iron fist. Sarah Nguyen's heart raced as she slipped past the flickering streetlights, her eyes darting left and right. The HOA's hidden cameras watched her every move, but she refused to be intimidated. She had a plan, a carefully crafted scheme that would push the boundaries of the HOA's power and expose their darkest secrets. Reaching her modest townhouse, Sarah quickly unlocked the door and darted inside, making sure to keep the box hidden from prying eyes. Once safely inside, she lifted the lid, revealing a litter of whimpering puppies. "Shat, it's okay," she whispered, stroking their soft fur. "You're safe now." The HOA had been clear. No pets allowed. But Sarah wasn't about to let their arbitrary rules dictate her life. These puppies were her family now, and she would do whatever it took to protect them. As she settled the puppies in their makeshift home, a sharp knock at the door sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. Steeling herself, Sarah peeked through the peephole, her breath catching in her throat at the sight of two HOA enforcers standing on her doorstep. "Mrs. Nguyen, we've received a report of unauthorized pets on the premises." The taller enforcer barked, his voice laced with menace. "Open up, or we'll be forced to take action." Sarah's mind raced, searching for a way out of this predicament. The HOA had eyes and ears everywhere, and they wouldn't hesitate to make an example of her. But she refused to back down. Squaring her shoulders, she opened the door, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," she said calmly, though her heart threatened to beat out of her chest. "I'm simply enjoying a quiet evening at home." The enforcers exchanged a knowing glance, their expressions hardening. "We have reason to believe you're harboring animals in violation of the HOA's pet policy," the shorter one said, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "If you refuse to cooperate, we'll have no choice but to take you into custody." Sarah's jaw tightened, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. She knew the HOA played dirty, but this was a new low, even for them. They were willing to go to any lengths to maintain their control, even if it meant terrorizing their own residents. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she repeated, her voice laced with defiance. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to return to my evening." The enforcers hesitated, their eyes narrowing as they scrutinized her. Sarah held her ground, refusing to be cowed by their intimidation tactics. Finally, the taller one spoke, his voice dripping with warning. "This isn't over, Mrs. Nguyen. We'll be watching you." With that, the enforcers turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Sarah trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. As the door clicked shut, she let out a shaky breath, her gaze falling to the box of puppies. "Don't worry, little ones," she whispered, a glimmer of resolve burning in her eyes. "I won't let them take you away." Sarah Nguyen was no ordinary homeowner. She was a strategic genius, a master of the game that HOA had been playing for years. And now the battle lines had been drawn. This was war, and she was ready to win. The sun had barely risen, but Sarah Nguyen was already hard at work, her mind racing with a flurry of plans and countermoves. The HOA enforcers' visit the night before had been a stark reminder of the high stakes she was facing, but she refused to be intimidated. Sitting at her kitchen table, surrounded by the now sleeping puppies, Sarah pored over a stack of documents, her brow furrowed in concentration. The HOA's bylaws were a confusing web of legalese, but she was determined to find a loophole, a way to keep her furry companions safe from the clutches of the oppressive organization. "Okay, let's see," she murmured, her fingers tracing the fine print. "Pets are strictly prohibited, unless—" Her eyes widened as she stumbled upon a clause that could work in her favor. "Unless the homeowner can provide medical documentation of a service animal requirement." A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. The HOA may have thought they had her cornered, but Sarah was about to turn the tables. Springing into action, she gathered the necessary paperwork and made a series of phone calls, her voice calm and confident as she navigated the bureaucratic maze. By the time the morning had passed, Sarah had secured the proper documentation, complete with the seal of a reputable veterinarian. Now all she had to do was wait for the HOA's next move. The silence was shattered by the sound of a car door slamming, and Sarah peered out the window to see the familiar black SUVs of the HOA enforcers pulling up to the curb. Her heart raced, but she refused to let her nerves show. This was her game now. Steeling herself, Sarah opened the door, greeting the enforcers with a polite smile. "Good morning, gentlemen. I assume you're here about the puppies." The taller enforcer's brow furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Mrs. Nguyen, we've received numerous complaints about unauthorized pets on the premises. I'm afraid we have no choice but to confiscate them." Sarah held up a hand, her expression unwavering. "Actually, I think you'll find that these are not ordinary pets, but rather service animals." She presented the paperwork, her gaze level and uncompromising. I have the proper documentation as required by the HOA's own bylaws. The enforcers exchanged a puzzled glance, their bravado faltering. Service animals? The shorter one echoed, his voice laced with uncertainty. That's right, Sarah said, her tone brooking no argument. These puppies are essential to my well-being, and I have every right to keep them here. She paused, letting her words sink in. Unless, of course, you'd like to challenge the legality of my claim. The enforcers shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught off guard by Sarah's confident, almost defiant stance. They knew the HOA's rules inside and out, but Sarah had managed to find a loophole, and they were unsure of how to proceed. After a tense moment of silence, the taller enforcer let out a frustrated sigh. Very well, Mrs. Nguyen, but be warned, we'll be keeping a close eye on you and your service animals. With that, the enforcers turned and stalked back to their SUVs, their departure punctuated by the rumble of the engines. Sarah watched them go, a sense of triumph swelling in her chest. She had won this round, but she knew the HOA wouldn't give up so easily. They were a formidable opponent, and they would stop at nothing to maintain their control of the community. Closing the door, Sarah returned to the puppies, a determined gleam in her eyes. Looks like we're safe for now, little ones, she murmured, stroking their soft fur. But this is just the beginning. The HOA isn't going to know what hit them. With that, she set to work, her mind already whirring with new strategies and plans. The battle lines had been drawn, and Sarah Nguyen was more than ready to take on the corrupt homeowners association that had terrorized her community for far too long. The rain had finally stopped, but the air still hung heavy with tension as Sarah Nguyen stepped out of her townhouse, the puppies securely tucked away inside. She knew the HOA enforcers would be watching her every move, but she refused to be cowed by their intimidation tactics. Striding down the rain-soaked sidewalk, Sarah's gaze swept the community, taking in the manicured lawns and the perfectly symmetrical homes. The Maple Crest community was a picture-perfect facade, but Sarah knew the ugly truth that lay beneath the surface. As she approached the towering gates of the HOA's headquarters, Sarah steeled herself for the confrontation to come. This was the heart of the beast, the nerve center of the organization that had held her community in its iron grip for far too long. Pushing open the door, Sarah was greeted by the sterile clinical atmosphere of the HOA's offices. The receptionist, a sharply dressed woman with a perpetual frown, eyed her with thinly veiled disdain. "Can I help you, Mrs. Nguyen?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. Sarah straightened her shoulders, refusing to be intimidated. "I need to speak with the board of directors," she said, her tone unwavering. "It's a matter of utmost importance." The receptionist's eyes narrowed, but after a moment she nodded stiffly. "Very well. Follow me." Sarah trailed after the woman, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was walking into the lion's den, but she was determined to hold her ground. The fate of her furry companions depended on it. The boardroom was a vast, sterile space adorned with a massive oak table and a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the community. The 5 members of the HOA board sat around the table, their expressions a mix of curiosity and annoyance. Mrs. Nguyen, the board president, a severe-looking woman with graying hair, spoke up. "To what do we owe this unexpected visit?" Sarah took a deep breath, then launched into her carefully rehearsed speech. "I'm here to discuss the recent incidents regarding my service animals," she said, her gaze unwavering. "As you're aware, I have the proper documentation, and I intend to keep them in my home." The board members exchanged a series of tense glances, their brows furrowing. "Service animals?" The president echoed, her voice laced with skepticism. "Forgive us, Mrs. Nguyen, but we have our doubts about the legitimacy of your claim." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she refused to back down. "I assure you, my documentation is entirely legitimate," she said, her words dripping with conviction. "And I'm prepared to take this matter to court if necessary." The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions darkening. Sarah could practically feel the tension in the room, the underlying current of resentment and power struggle. "Mrs. Nguyen, you must understand that the HOA has a responsibility to maintain the integrity and aesthetics of this community," the president said, her tone laced with a hint of warning. "Allowing pets, regardless of their supposed purpose, would set a dangerous precedent." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "With all due respect, madam, your responsibility is to serve the residents of this community, not to dictate their lives," she retorted, her voice steely. "And I have every right to keep my service animals in my home." The board members exchanged another round of uneasy glances, their expressions a mix of frustration and begrudging respect. It was clear that Sarah Nguyen was no ordinary homeowner, and they were not prepared for the level of resistance she was willing to offer. "Very well, Mrs. Nguyen," the president said, her voice clipped. "We will reconsider your case, but be warned, we will be watching you closely." Sarah nodded, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. "I wouldn't have it any other way," she said, her words dripping with defiance. With that, she turned and strode out of the boardroom, her head held high. The battle lines had been drawn, and Sarah Nguyen was more determined than ever to bring down the corrupt HOA that had terrorized her community for far too long. The shadows gathered, cloaking the streets of Maple Crest in a veil of darkness as the sun dipped below the horizon. In the quiet, Sarah Nguyen sat at her kitchen table, her fingers drumming a steady rhythm against the worn wood. The puppies slumbered peacefully, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. Sarah's gaze was fixed on the stack of documents before her, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had won the first round against the HOA, but she knew the war was far from over. The corrupt organization would not give up so easily, and she needed to be prepared for their next move. As she pored over the bylaws, a knock at the door shattered the stillness. Sarah's heart raced, her fingers instinctively reaching for the heavy paperweight on the table. Cautiously, she approached the door, peering through the peephole. To her surprise, it was not the familiar black SUVs of the HOA enforcers, but a lone figure standing in the shadows. Swallowing hard, Sarah opened the door, her grip tightening on the paperweight. Mrs. Nguyen, a familiar voice greeted her, and Sarah felt her shoulders relax ever so slightly. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Wilkins, a kind-faced woman who had always been a friendly face in the community. "Mrs. Wilkins," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with relief and curiosity. "What are you doing here at this hour?" The older woman's expression was grave, her eyes darting around nervously. "I came to warn you, Sarah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The HOA, they're planning something." Sarah's blood ran cold, and she ushered her neighbor inside, her mind racing. "What do you mean they're planning something?" she demanded, her voice laced with a hint of panic. Mrs. Wilkins wrung her hands, her gaze downcast. "I overheard them in the grocery store. They were talking about you, about the puppies. They said they were going to find a way to get rid of them, no matter what." Sarah felt her stomach twist with dread. She had known the HOA would not take her defiance lightly, but the thought of them resorting to such underhanded tactics sent a chill down her spine. "Did they say anything else?" she pressed, her voice taut with tension. Mrs. Wilkins shook her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sympathy. "I'm sorry, Sarah, that's all I heard. But you need to be careful. They're not going to stop until they get what they want." Sarah nodded, her mind whirring with a flurry of contingency plans. She had to protect the puppies no matter what. The HOA had already shown their willingness to bend the rules to suit their own agenda, and she knew they would stop at nothing to maintain their control of the community. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilkins," she said, her voice low and resolute. "I appreciate you taking the risk to warn me. I'll be sure to keep a close eye on things." The older woman nodded, a small, weary smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I wish I could do more, my dear. But the HOA, they have eyes and ears everywhere. Just be careful, won't you?" With that, Mrs. Wilkins slipped back into the night, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and the sleeping puppies. The air was thick with tension, and Sarah knew that the next move would be the HOAs. They were not going to back down, and she would have to be one step ahead of them if she had any hope of protecting her furry companions. Steeling herself, Sarah turned her attention back to the documents, her mind racing with a myriad of contingency plans. The battle lines had been drawn, and she was more determined than ever to bring down the corrupt Homeowners Association once and for all. The night air was thick with tension as Sarah Nguyen prowled the rain-soaked streets of Maple Crest, her eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of the HOA's presence. After Mrs. Wilkins' ominous warning, she knew she had to be on high alert. The puppies were safely tucked away in her townhouse, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The HOA had eyes and ears everywhere, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down even for a moment. As she rounded the corner, a glint of metal in the dim light caught her eye. Instinctively, she ducked behind a parked car, her heart pounding in her chest. Peering cautiously, she caught a glimpse of a surveillance camera, its red light blinking ominously. Sarah cursed under her breath, her mind racing. The HOA was watching her every move, and she knew they were just waiting for her to slip up. She had to be one step ahead of them, and that meant taking the fight to their own turf. Steeling her nerves, Sarah continued on, her steps measured and deliberate. She knew the community like the back of her hand, and she was determined to use that knowledge to her advantage. As she approached the towering gates of the HOA's headquarters, Sarah paused, her gaze sweeping the area. The lights were still on, casting an eerie glow over the otherwise deserted landscape. Taking a deep breath, she slipped through the gates, her movements swift and silent. The corridors were dimly lit, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as she navigated the maze of hallways. The HOA's headquarters were a fortress designed to keep the residents out and the organization's secrets in. Suddenly, a muffled sound caught her attention, and Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her ears. Straining her ears, she followed the noise, her footsteps barely audible as she approached a partially open door. Peering through the crack, Sarah's eyes widened at the sight that greeted her. The 5 members of the HOA board were gathered around a table, their voices hushed and urgent. "We can't let her win," the board president hissed, her expression twisted with a mixture of anger and fear. "The integrity of this community is at stake." Sarah's blood ran cold as she listened to the board members plot their next move, their words dripping with malice and a complete disregard for the well-being of the residents. "We'll need to dig deeper, find some way to discredit her," one of the men said, his brow furrowed in concentration. "And what about the puppies?" Another member chimed in, a sinister smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "We can't have her flaunting the rules like that." Sarah felt a surge of rage coursing through her veins, and she had to clench her fists to keep from bursting into the room and confronting them directly. These people were no longer just a threat to her. And the puppies, they were a threat to the entire community, and she knew she had to stop them at all costs. Slowly, she backed away from the door, her mind racing with a dozen different plans and contingencies. She had to get back to the puppies to make sure they were safe. And then she would strike back using the HOA's own weapons against them. As she slipped out of the headquarters, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of grim determination. The battle lines had been drawn, and she was more than ready to fight. The HOA had no idea what they were up against, and she was going to make them pay for their corruption and their disregard for the people they were supposed to serve. The rain had stopped, but the air still hung heavy with the scent of impending storm as Sarah and Nguyen made her way back to her townhouse, her mind racing with a dozen different plans and contingencies. The knowledge she had gleaned from her late-night excursion into the HOA's headquarters had only fueled her determination to bring down the corrupt organization that had terrorized her community for far too long. As she approached her home, Sarah's eyes narrowed, her gaze sweeping the area for any signs of the HOA's presence. The puppies were safe for now, but she knew it was only a matter of time before the organization made its next move. Slipping inside, Sarah quickly checked on the sleeping puppies, her heart swelling with a fierce protective instinct. "Don't worry, little ones," she whispered, stroking their soft fur. "I won't let them take you away." With a deep breath, she turned her attention to the stack of documents on the kitchen table, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she began to piece together a plan of attack. The HOA had underestimated her, and she was about to use that to her advantage. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the windows, Sarah emerged from her makeshift war room, a steely determination etched into her features. She knew what she had to do, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone stand in her way. Stepping out into the empty streets, Sarah made her way to the local news station, her steps unwavering. The HOA may have thought they had the upper hand, but she was about to turn the tables on them in a way they could never have anticipated. The newsroom was a bustling hive of activity, but Sarah navigated the maze of cubicles and workstations with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Approaching the editor-in-chief's office, she took a deep breath and knocked firmly on the door. Mrs. Nguyen, the editor, greeted her, his brow furrowing with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "This is an unexpected visit. What can I do for you?" Sarah wasted no time, her words tumbling out in a rapid-fire cascade. "I have a story for you, one that I think the entire community needs to hear," she said, her voice laced with a sense of urgency. "The HOA, they're corrupt. They're using their power to manipulate and control the residents, and they're willing to go to any lengths to maintain their grip on this community." The editor's eyes widened and he gestured for her to continue. Sarah launched into a detailed account of the HOA's underhanded tactics, their disregard for the well-being of the residents, and their blatant abuse of power. As she spoke, the editor's expression shifted from one of skepticism to one of growing concern. "This is a serious allegation, Mrs. Nguyen," he said, his voice laced with a hint of caution. "Do you have any proof to back up these claims?" Sarah's lips curved into a grim smile. "As a matter of fact, I do," she said, reaching into her bag and pulling out a stack of documents. "I've been gathering evidence for weeks, and I'm prepared to blow this story wide open." The editor's eyes scanned the documents, his brow furrowing as he pored over the damning information. This is explosive," he murmured, his gaze shifting back to Sarah. "Are you sure you're prepared to take on the HOA? They're a powerful organization, and they won't take kindly to this kind of exposure." Sarah's expression hardened and her jaw set with determination. "I'm more than prepared," she said, her voice unwavering. "The HOA has terrorized this community for far too long, and it's time for them to be held accountable. I'm ready to take them down, no matter what it takes." The editor nodded, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "Then let's get to work," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The streets of Maple Crest were eerily silent as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and the impeccably maintained homes. Sarah Nguyen stood at her window, her gaze fixed on the towering gates of the HOA headquarters. She knew the moment of reckoning was drawing near. Earlier that day, the local news station had released a scathing expose on the corruption and abuse of power within the Maple Crest Homeowners Association. The story had sent shockwaves through the community, with residents flocking to social media to voice their outrage and demand change. Sarah had watched the story unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and trepidation. She knew the HOA would not take this lying down, and she steeled herself for the inevitable backlash. Sure enough, as the sun began to set, the familiar black SUVs of the HOA enforcers began to converge on her street, their engines rumbling with menace. Sarah's heart raced, but she refused to be intimidated. She had come too far to back down now. Stepping out onto her front porch, Sarah squared her shoulders, her gaze unwavering as the enforcers approached. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice dripping with a hint of defiance. The taller enforcer stepped forward, his expression grim. "Mrs. Nguyen, we've been instructed to inform you that your so-called service animals are in violation of the HOA's pet policy," he said, his tone laced with a warning. "You have until tomorrow to remove them from the premises or will be forced to take action." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she refused to back down. "I'm afraid that's not going to happen," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "The residents of this community have spoken, and they've demanded that the HOA be held accountable for their corrupt practices." The enforcer's expression darkened, and he took a step closer, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "This is your final warning, Mrs. Nguyen. If you don't comply, we'll have no choice but to take you into custody." Sarah's eyes narrowed, and she leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Go ahead and try," she said, her words dripping with defiance. "But I have the entire community behind me, and I'm not going down without a fight." The enforcer hesitated, his gaze flickering with a hint of uncertainty. Sarah could see the wheels turning in his mind as he weighed the consequences of his actions. The residents were already up in arms, and any heavy-handed tactics from the HOA would only serve to fuel the fire. Suddenly, a commotion erupted from the direction of the HOA headquarters, and the enforcers turned, their attention diverted. Sarah seized the opportunity, slipping back into her home and quickly locking the door behind her. Peering out the window, she watched as a crowd of residents began to gather, their voices raised in a chorus of protest. The HOA board members had emerged from their fortress, their expressions a mix of panic and defiance, but they were clearly outnumbered and outmatched. As the confrontation unfolded, Sarah felt a surge of pride and vindication. The residents of Maple Crest had finally found their voice, and they were refusing to be silenced. The HOA's reign of terror was coming to an end, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. But even as the battle raged on outside, Sarah knew that the war was far from over. The HOA would not go down without a fight, and she had to be prepared for their next move. With a deep breath, she turned her attention back to the puppies, her gaze filled with a fierce, unwavering determination. "Don't worry, little ones," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of the crowd. "I'm not going to let them take you away. Not now. Not ever." The air was thick with tension as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the now battered streets of Maple Crest. The confrontation between the residents and the HOA had been a fierce one, with tempers flaring and accusations flying in all directions. Sarah Nguyen stood at her window, her gaze fixed on the aftermath of the clash. The HOA enforcers had retreated, their tails tucked firmly between their legs, but she knew this was far from over. The corrupt organization would not go down without a fight, and she had to be ready for their next move. As she watched the residents begin to disperse, a lone figure caught her eye. Mrs. Wilkins, her neighbor and the one who had first warned her of the HOA's nefarious plans, Sarah quickly slipped out the door, hurrying to catch up with the older woman. "Mrs. Wilkins," she called out, her voice tinged with a mix of relief and concern. The older woman turned, her expression a mixture of worry and determination. "Sarah, my dear," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm so glad you're all right." Sarah placed a comforting hand on her neighbor's arm, her gaze searching the older woman's face. "Are you okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed with worry. Mrs. Wilkins nodded, though the fear in her eyes betrayed her. "I'll be fine, my dear," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the HOA, they're not going to give up so easily. They're furious, and they'll be coming for you." Sarah's jaw tightened, her mind already racing with contingency plans. "I know," she said, her voice laced with a grim determination. "But I'm not going to let them win. Not this time." Mrs. Wilkins reached out, grasping Sarah's hand with a trembling grip. "Please, Sarah, be careful," she pleaded, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and admiration. "The HOA, they'll stop at nothing to get what they want." Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. "I know," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "But I'm not going to back down. Not when the entire community is counting on me." With a final squeeze of her neighbor's hand, Sarah turned and hurried back to her townhouse, her mind racing with a flurry of plans and contingencies. She knew the HOA was coming, and she had to be ready. As she stepped through the door, the puppies greeted her with a chorus of excited yips, their tails wagging furiously. Sarah couldn't help but smile, a surge of protectiveness washing over her. "Don't worry, little ones," she murmured, stroking their soft fur. "I'm going to make sure the HOA never lays a hand on you." Quickly, she set to work, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she double-checked her preparations. The evidence was in the hands of the local news station, and the residents were fired up and ready to fight. But she knew the HOA would not go down without a fight, and she had to be ready. As the night wore on, Sarah's vigilance never wavered. She paced the floor, her eyes trained on the darkness beyond the windows, her ears attuned to the slightest sound. And then, just as the first hint of dawn began to creep over the horizon, she heard it, the rumble of engines, the slamming of car doors. Steeling herself, Sarah moved to the window, her gaze narrowing as she watched the familiar black SUVs of the HOA enforcers pull up to the curb. This was it, the final showdown, and she was more than ready. As the enforcers approached her door, Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the doorknob. "Bring it on," she murmured, her voice laced with a defiant challenge. The battle lines had been drawn, and Sarah Nguyen was ready to win.